When King Henry III of England died in 1272, he left behind a dynasty that had survived rebellion, near civil war, and the crumbling of royal authority. But what became of the children who grew up in that fragile, glittering court? From the war-hardened heir who would conquer Wales, to the princess who carried English blood to the throne of Scotland, to the youngest whose life ended before she could speak her father's name, the children of Henry III shaped kingdoms far beyond their own lifetimes. In this video, we'll trace each of their lives, birth to legacy, following how their stories unfolded, where their bloodlines led, and how the Plantagenet family branched across Europe. This is the complete story of Henry III's children, the heirs, the peacemakers, the founders, and the forgotten. Henry III ruled England for 56 years from 1216 to 1272, making him one of the longest reigning monarchs in English history. Known for his piety, his architectural ambitions at Westminster Abbey, and his struggles with rebellious barons, Henry was also a devoted family man. His marriage to Eleanor of Provence in 1236 produced 5 children who would carry the Plantagenet bloodline across medieval Europe. These were turbulent times. Henry's reign witnessed the Barons' War, where Simon de Montfort and other nobles challenged royal authority. The king faced capture, humiliation, and the near collapse of his dynasty. Yet through it all, his children grew up in a court that valued culture, diplomacy, and continental connections. Each of Henry's children tells a different story of medieval power. Their marriages forged alliances that would shape England, Scotland, and France for centuries. Their descendants would sit on thrones, lead crusades, and fight civil wars that redrew the map of Europe. We'll follow them one by one, from the warlike heir who transformed England into an empire, to the child who never grew up but left her mark in Westminster stone. On June 17, 1239, Westminster Palace echoed with the cries of a newborn prince. Edward was born to a dynasty still finding its footing. His father, Henry III, had been crowned at just 9 years old, and the wounds of civil war were still fresh in royal memory. This heir represented hope, the continuation of a Plantagenet line that had seemed fragile since King John's disasters. Edward's birth came at a moment when Henry was finally stabilizing his reign. The young king had married Eleanor of Provence 3 years earlier, cementing an alliance with the powerful French nobility. Their firstborn son would grow up in a court increasingly influenced by continental culture, art, and political sophistication. From his earliest years, Edward was groomed for kingship in ways his father never had been. While Henry had inherited a throne as a child during wartime, Edward would be trained systematically for the complexities of royal power. Edward's childhood unfolded against the backdrop of mounting tension between his father and the English nobility. By the 1250s, Henry III's expensive foreign ventures and reliance on foreign advisors had sparked widespread resentment among his barons. The young prince received a comprehensive education befitting a future king. He learned Latin, French, and the arts of war. His tutors included some of the most learned men in Europe, reflecting Henry's commitment to cultural refinement. But Edward's real education would come through the harsh realities of political conflict. In 1258, when Edward was 19, the Barons' War erupted. Led by Simon de Montfort, the rebellious nobles forced Henry to accept the provisions of Oxford, dramatically limiting royal power. Edward initially sided with the reformers, perhaps influenced by their promises of military glory. This decision would prove a crucial learning experience about the dangers of political miscalculation. The conflict reached its climax at the Battle of Lewes in 1764, where Edward's rashness nearly cost the Royalists everything. His impetuous cavalry charge broke the rebel lines but pursued too far, leaving the main royal army exposed. Henry III and Edward were both captured, spending over a year in the humiliating custody of de Montfort. This captivity transformed Edward. He learned patience, strategic thinking, and the value of reliable allies. When he escaped in 1265, he had become a different man, calculating, determined, and utterly focused on crushing the rebellion. At the Battle of Evesham, Edward's tactical brilliance led to de Montfort's death and the restoration of royal authority. The Barons' War taught Edward that English kingship required both military prowess and political cunning. Unlike his father, who often relied on diplomacy and compromise, Edward understood that sometimes only force could secure royal power. In 1270, Edward embarked on crusade to the Holy Land, partly to escape the lingering tensions in England and partly to establish his international reputation. The Ninth Crusade proved to be the last major effort to reclaim Jerusalem, and Edward's participation marked him as a serious player in European politics. The crusade was militarily unsuccessful but politically valuable. Edward formed relationships with other European rulers and demonstrated his commitment to the Christian cause that still motivated medieval nobility. More importantly, he learned about siege warfare, logistics, and coalition building, skills he would later apply in Wales and Scotland. Word of Henry III's death reached Edward in Sicily in 1272 as he returned from the Holy Land. Remarkably, there was no succession crisis. Edward's claim was universally accepted, and he took 2 years to return to England for his coronation. This smooth transition reflected both Edward's established reputation and the stability Henry had ultimately achieved. Edward's coronation in 1274 marked the beginning of a new kind of English kingship. Where Henry had been scholarly and pious, Edward was practical and expansionist. He combined his father's cultural sophistication with a warrior's instincts and a lawyer's attention to administrative detail. Edward's personal life reflected his strategic approach to kingship. His first marriage to Eleanor of Castile in 1254 had been arranged by Henry III to secure an alliance with Castile and strengthen Edward's position in Gascony. Eleanor proved to be not just a diplomatic asset, but a genuine partner in ruling. The couple had 16 children, though many died young. A common tragedy in medieval royal families, their surviving children would become crucial pieces in Edward's diplomatic strategy. He understood that royal marriages were the foundation of international alliances, and he arranged his children's matches with extraordinary care. After Eleanor's death in 1290, Edward married Margaret of France in 1299. This second marriage, contracted when Edward was 60, served multiple purposes. It produced additional heirs, secured peace with France, and demonstrated that even elderly kings could forge new alliances through marriage. Edward's reign transformed England from a struggling kingdom into the dominant power in the British Isles. His conquest of Wales between 1277 and 1283 was systematic and thorough. Unlike previous English campaigns that had achieved temporary submission, Edward built an iron ring of castles, Conwy, Caernarfon, Harlech, that permanently incorporated Wales into the English kingdom. The conquest of Wales revealed Edward's administrative genius. He didn't simply destroy Welsh institutions, but carefully replaced them with English ones. The Statute of Rhuddlan in Repton of 84 formally annexed Wales, creating new shires and extending English law. This approach, conquest followed by institutional integration, became Edward's standard method. Scotland proved more challenging. When the Scottish succession crisis erupted in 1290 following the death of the child queen Margaret, his own great-niece, Edward positioned himself as overlord of Scotland. His initial success in installing John Balliol as a puppet king eventually backfired when Scottish resentment led to the Wars of Scottish Independence. Edward's Scottish campaigns, though ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated his unwillingness to accept limits on English power. He understood that control of Scotland was essential for long-term English security, even if the immediate costs were enormous. Domestically, Edward reformed English law and administration with the same systematic approach he applied to conquest. The Statutes of Westminster codified legal procedures, while his expulsion of the Jews in 1290 reflected both religious prejudice and fiscal desperation. Edward was a pragmatic ruler who used whatever tools, legal, military, or financial, served royal interests. Edward died in 1307 while campaigning in Scotland, his body literally wearing out from decades of warfare. He left behind a transformed kingdom. England now dominated Wales completely, claimed overlordship of Scotland, and possessed the most sophisticated administrative machinery in medieval Europe. His son Edward II inherited these achievements but lacked his father's military and political skills. The disastrous reign that followed, marked by defeat at Bannockburn, civil war, and eventual deposition, seemed to validate critics who argued that Edward I's aggressive expansionism had overextended English resources. Yet Edward I's bloodline would ultimately vindicate his ambitions. Through his descendants, the Plantagenet claim would pass to the houses of Lancaster and York, fueling the Wars of the Roses. Eventually, that bloodline would emerge triumphant in the Tudor dynasty and continue through the Stuarts to the modern Windsor line. Today, every British monarch traces their ancestry back through Edward I to Henry III. The boy born in Westminster Palace in 1239 founded a royal line that has endured for nearly 8 centuries. The relationship between Henry III and his eldest son evolved from the typical medieval dynamic of royal father and heir to something approaching genuine partnership. Henry's early struggles with rebellious barons had taught him the importance of preparing his successor, and he invested enormous effort in Edward's education and training. Yet their approaches to kingship differed fundamentally. Henry valued culture, learning, and diplomatic finesse. His greatest achievements were architectural. Westminster Abbey stands as his monument. Edward inherited his father's appreciation for grandeur but applied it to military and administrative projects. Where Henry often sought compromise and accommodation with his opponents, Edward believed in the decisive application of force. The son learned from the father's struggles that English kingship required strength as well as legitimacy. Margaret was born at Windsor Castle in September 1240, just 15 months after her brother Edward. As the eldest daughter of Henry III and Eleanor of Provence, she entered a world where royal daughters served as diplomatic instruments, their marriages capable of forging alliances or ending wars. From her earliest years, Margaret was groomed for a life of international significance. The court culture that shaped her emphasized languages, literature, and the sophisticated manners expected of European royalty. Eleanor of Provence, herself a product of the cultured Provençal court, ensured that her daughter received an education befitting a future queen. Margaret grew up during the relative calm of the late 1240s, before the political storms that would dominate her brother's youth. This early stability allowed her to develop the grace and diplomatic skills that would serve her well in Scotland. On December 26, 1251, 11-year-old Margaret married 10-year-old Alexander III of Scotland at York Minster. The wedding was a spectacular political theater designed to demonstrate the new alliance between England and Scotland after centuries of intermittent warfare. Henry III spared no expense on the ceremony. The guest list included the greatest nobles of both kingdoms, and the festivities lasted for days. Contemporary chroniclers described the wedding as one of the most magnificent royal celebrations of the 13th century, reflecting both Henry's love for pageantry and his understanding of marriage as statecraft. The marriage represented Henry III's diplomatic masterpiece. By wedding his daughter to the young Scottish king, he hoped to achieve through kinship what English armies had failed to accomplish through conquest. Margaret carried with her not just personal alliance, but the possibility of uniting the two kingdoms through future generations. Both bride and groom were children, so the marriage remained unconsummated for several years. Margaret continued her education in the English court while maintaining formal ties to Scotland. This arrangement allowed both kingdoms to benefit from the alliance while the young couple matured. When Margaret finally took up residence in Scotland around 1260, she found herself in a kingdom very different from her father's England. Scotland was less centralized, more clan-based, and more suspicious of foreign influence. As an English princess, Margaret faced the delicate task of becoming Scottish while maintaining her diplomatic value to both kingdoms. Alexander III proved to be an effective king and, by contemporary accounts, a devoted husband. Their marriage appears to have been genuinely affectionate, a fortunate outcome in an age when royal marriages were purely political arrangements. Margaret adapted well to Scottish court life, learning to navigate the complex relationships among Scottish nobles while maintaining correspondence with her English family. As queen consort, Margaret played the traditional medieval role of royal wife, producing heirs, managing court culture, and serving as her husband's diplomatic representative. She also served as a crucial communication channel between the English and Scottish courts, helping to maintain the peace that her marriage had created. Margaret's position was complicated by the ongoing tensions between her birth family and her adopted kingdom. When disputes arose between England and Scotland, she found herself torn between loyalty to her father and husband. Her letters, preserved in royal archives, reveal a woman trying to balance conflicting loyalties while maintaining her influence in both courts. Margaret's most important contribution to both kingdoms was producing the next generation of Scottish royalty. She gave birth to 3 children, Alexander in 1264, David in 1272, and Margaret in 1261. These children represented the future of the Scottish monarchy and the continuing alliance between England and Scotland. Prince Alexander was groomed as heir to the Scottish throne, receiving an education that combined Scottish traditions with the broader European culture his mother represented. Prince David served as a spare heir, while Princess Margaret carried the potential for future diplomatic marriages. Margaret took an active role in her children's education, ensuring they understood both their Scottish heritage and their connections to the broader European royal family. She wanted them to be fully Scottish while maintaining the cultural sophistication of the Plantagenet court. The birth of her children solidified Margaret's position in Scotland. No longer just an English princess serving diplomatic purposes, she was now the mother of future Scottish kings. This transformation from foreign bride to royal matriarch represented the successful achievement of Henry III's diplomatic strategy. Tragedy struck the Scottish royal family in the 1280s. Prince David died young, followed by Prince Alexander in 1284. King Alexander III himself died in 1286, leaving the throne to Margaret's granddaughter, also named Margaret but known to history as the Maid of Norway. Margaret of England had died in 1275, 11 years before the crisis that would devastate her family's legacy. She was spared witnessing the collapse of everything her marriage had been designed to achieve. Her granddaughter, the Maid of Norway, was just 6 years old when she inherited the Scottish throne. The arrangement for the Maid of Norway's eventual marriage to Edward of Caernarfon, later Edward II, would have fulfilled Henry III's ultimate diplomatic vision, uniting England and Scotland under a single crown through Margaret's bloodline. However, the child queen died in 1290 during her voyage from Norway to Scotland, ending the direct line from Margaret's marriage. This death crisis precipitated the succession dispute that led Edward I to claim overlordship of Scotland and ultimately to the wars of Scottish independence. The diplomatic alliance that Margaret's marriage had created disappeared, replaced by the military conquest her marriage had been designed to prevent. The relationship between Margaret and her father appears to have remained close throughout her life. Henry III's letters revealed genuine affection for his eldest daughter and pride in her success as Queen of Scotland. He saw her marriage as vindication of his diplomatic approach to international relations. Margaret's position as Henry's diplomatic ambassador to Scotland gave her unusual influence for a medieval royal daughter. She could communicate directly with both courts and often served as an intermediary in disputes. This role required considerable political skill and suggests that Henry trusted her judgment in complex diplomatic situations. When Margaret died in 1275, Henry III mourned her as both daughter and diplomatic partner. Contemporary accounts describe his grief as profound, reflecting not just personal loss, but recognition that Margaret's death weakened the English-Scottish alliance that had been central to his foreign policy. The legacy of Margaret's marriage survived her death for over a decade, maintaining peace between England and Scotland until the succession crisis of 1290. In this sense, Henry III's diplomatic investment in his daughter's marriage proved successful for a generation, even if it ultimately failed to achieve its larger goals. Beatrice was born in Bordeaux in June 1242 during one of her father's expeditions to secure his French territories. Her birth in Gascony rather than England symbolized the continental connections that would define her life. As daughter of an English king born on French soil, Beatrice embodied the complex international identity of the Plantagenet dynasty. The choice of name reflected Henry III's diplomatic ambitions. Beatrice honored both her maternal grandmother, Beatrice of Savoy, and the broader European noble network that Henry hoped to strengthen through his children's marriages. From birth, she was destined for a continental rather than insular English future. Growing up in Henry's increasingly sophisticated court, Beatrice received an education designed to prepare her for marriage into French nobility. She learned multiple languages, courtly etiquette, and the diplomatic skills essential for a royal daughter whose marriage would serve English interests abroad. Beatrice's childhood unfolded during the height of Henry III's cultural achievements. The 1240s and 1250s saw the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey, the expansion of royal art collections, and the flourishing of court culture that made England a center of European learning and refinement. This environment shaped Beatrice profoundly. She developed sophisticated tastes in art, literature, and music that would later influence Breton court culture. Her education included not just the practical skills of queenship, but also the intellectual accomplishments that marked the educated European nobility. Unlike her sister Margaret, whose marriage to Scotland was arranged early, Beatrice remained at the English court longer. This extended residence in her father's household allowed her to develop a closer relationship with Henry III, and to absorb more completely the cultural values he promoted. The delayed arrangement of her marriage may have reflected Henry's reluctance to part with his second daughter, or the complex negotiations required to secure the most advantageous continental alliance. European marriage diplomacy in the 13th century required careful timing and extensive negotiation. In 1260, 18-year-old Beatrice married John II, Duke of Brittany, in a ceremony that celebrated the alliance between England and one of France's most strategically important duchies. Brittany controlled crucial ports and commanded significant military resources, making it a valuable ally for English interests in France. The marriage negotiations had been complex, involving not just the English and Breton courts, but also the French king, who maintained overlordship of Brittany. Henry III had to balance his desire for a Breton alliance against the risk of antagonizing French royal authority. Beatrice's dowry reflected both her royal status and the strategic value of the alliance. Henry provided substantial financial support and guaranteed military assistance to Brittany in certain circumstances. This arrangement demonstrated the continuing English commitment to maintaining influence in continental politics. The wedding itself was a major diplomatic event attended by representatives from across Western Europe. Contemporary chroniclers noted the magnificence of the ceremony and the careful attention to protocol that reflected the marriage's international significance. As Duchess of Brittany, Beatrice found herself at the center of the complex political relationships that defined medieval France. Brittany occupied a unique position, nominally subject to French royal authority but practically independent, with its own laws, customs, and military traditions. Beatrice adapted successfully to Breton culture while maintaining her English connections. She learned Breton customs and supported local religious institutions, but her correspondence with the English court continued throughout her life. This dual identity allowed her to serve as an effective diplomatic bridge between England and Brittany. Her role as Duchess involved considerable practical responsibility. Medieval duchesses were expected to manage estates, oversee legal proceedings, and represent ducal authority when their husbands were absent. Beatrice appears to have fulfilled these duties competently, earning the respect of Breton nobles. The relationship between Beatrice and John II seems to have been successful both personally and politically. Contemporary sources suggest mutual respect and cooperation in managing the duchy's complex affairs. Their partnership strengthened Breton independence while maintaining valuable English connections. Beatrice and John II had 6 children, the most significant being their son Arthur II, who would become Duke of Brittany and play a crucial role in late medieval French politics. Through Arthur, Beatrice's bloodline would eventually reach the pinnacle of European power. Arthur II married Yolande de Dreux, further strengthening Breton noble connections. Their descendants would include John Fatih, Duke of Brittany, one of the most powerful nobles in 14th century France. The family's influence peaked with Anne of Brittany, who became Queen of France through marriages to Charles VIII and Louis XII. Anne of Brittany represented the culmination of the Anglo-Breton alliance that Beatrice's marriage had initiated. Though Anne ultimately brought Brittany into direct French control, she did so from a position of strength that owed much to the independence her English great-great-grandmother had helped maintain. Through Anne of Brittany's marriages, Beatrice's bloodline entered the French royal family directly. Later French kings, including the Bourbons who ruled France until the Revolution, carried genetic inheritance from Henry III's daughter born in Bordeaux. Beatrice died in 1275, the same year as her sister Margaret, ending an era in which Henry III's daughters had personally maintained England's continental alliances. Her death weakened the English-Breton connection just as Anglo-French tensions were increasing under Edward I. The Breton alliance that Beatrice had embodied proved valuable during the subsequent Anglo-French wars. Breton ports provided crucial support for English military operations in France, while Breton nobles often sided with England against French royal authority. This pattern continued through the Hundred Years' War. Beatrice's cultural legacy in Brittany proved as significant as her political influence. She had brought English artistic styles, literary traditions, and architectural innovations to the Breton court. The cultural exchange initiated by her marriage enriched both English and Breton civilization. The marriage alliance strategy that Beatrice represented became a model for later English diplomacy. Subsequent English kings would repeatedly seek continental allies through marriage connections, understanding that royal daughters could achieve through diplomacy what armies often could not accomplish through conquest. Henry III's decision to marry Beatrice into Breton nobility reflected his sophisticated understanding of continental politics. Rather than seeking the most prestigious match possible, he chose an alliance that would provide practical military and economic benefits to English interests. The success of Beatrice's marriage validated Henry's approach to international relations. While his son Edward would rely primarily on military force to achieve English objectives, Henry demonstrated that diplomatic marriages could create lasting alliances that served English interests for generations. Beatrice's life embodied Henry III's vision of England as a European power rather than an isolated island kingdom. Through her marriage and descendants, English influence extended deep into continental politics in ways that pure military conquest could never have achieved. The Breton connection that began with Beatrice's marriage would outlast the Plantagenet dynasty itself, demonstrating the enduring value of Henry III's diplomatic investments in his children's futures. Edmund was born at Westminster Palace on January 16, 1245, the second surviving son of Henry III and Eleanor of Provence. His birth provided the dynasty with a crucial spare heir at a time when royal mortality remained high and succession security was never guaranteed. The nickname Crouchback appears in later sources, though its origin remains disputed. Some historians suggest it referred to a physical deformity, while others argue it derived from crossback, indicating his eventual participation in crusading activities. More likely, it simply distinguished him from the many other Edmunds in medieval genealogies. From birth, Edmund was destined for a supporting role in the Plantagenet dynasty. As second son, he would serve his brother Edward's interest while building his own power base through strategic marriages and territorial acquisitions. This position required diplomatic skill and political intelligence. Henry III understood the importance of providing adequately for younger sons. Medieval history was littered with civil wars caused by dissatisfied royal brothers, and Henry was determined to ensure Edmund's loyalty through generous endowments and significant responsibilities. Edmund's education paralleled his older brother's, but with less pressure and more flexibility. While Edward was groomed specifically for kingship, Edmund could pursue interests in law, administration, and diplomacy that would serve him well as a royal brother and territorial magnate. During the Barons' War, Edmund generally supported the royalist cause, though he was too young to play a significant military role. The conflict taught him valuable lessons about the importance of noble loyalty and the dangers of aristocratic rebellion that would influence his later political career. Unlike Edward, who was captured at Lewes and held prisoner by the rebels, Edmund avoided the trauma of extended captivity. This difference in experience may explain why Edmund typically favored negotiation over confrontation in later political disputes. The aftermath of the Barons' War provided Edmund with his first major opportunities for advancement. As Henry III restored royal authority, he rewarded loyal supporters with lands and titles confiscated from rebels. Edmund benefited significantly from this redistribution of noble wealth. In 1267, Edmund received the earldom of Leicester, one of the most prestigious titles in England. The irony was deliberate. Leicester had been Simon de Montfort's primary title, and granting it to a royal son demonstrated the complete defeat of the rebellion and the restoration of royal authority. Edmund's promotion to Earl of Lancaster in 1267 provided him with even greater resources and influence. The Lancaster inheritance included vast estates across northern England, making Edmund one of the wealthiest nobles in the kingdom and establishing the power base that would eventually challenge royal authority in the next century. His participation in the Lord Edward's crusade to the Holy Land in 1270–1272 established Edmund's reputation as a serious military commander. Though the crusade achieved little militarily, it provided valuable experience in coalition warfare and international diplomacy. The crusading connection gave Edmund credibility with the European nobility and demonstrated his commitment to the religious ideals that still motivated much of medieval politics. This reputation served him well in later negotiations with continental powers. Edmund's marriage to Blanche of Artois in 1276 represented one of the most significant diplomatic achievements of Edward I's early reign. Blanche was the widow of Henry I of Navarre and brought both wealth and strategic connections to the English royal family. The marriage was controversial because Blanche was significantly older than Edmund and had been married before. However, her connections to the French royal family and her substantial inheritance in France made her an extremely valuable bride for English diplomatic purposes. Through Blanche, Edmund gained claims to territory in France and connections to the highest levels of continental nobility. This marriage transformed him from an English earl into a European magnate with interest and influence extending far beyond England. The couple's children would inherit both English royal blood and French noble connections, creating opportunities for future diplomatic alliances and territorial claims. Edmund's descendants would eventually use these connections to challenge for the English throne itself. By the 1280s, Edmund had become one of the most powerful magnates in England. His estates included not just the Lancaster inheritance, but also additional grants from his brother Edward I. This wealth allowed him to maintain a household and military retinue befitting his royal status. Edmund used his resources to support Edward I's military campaigns in Wales and Scotland. His financial contributions and military service demonstrated loyalty to the crown while establishing his own reputation as a major political figure. This pattern of service and reward characterized their relationship throughout Edmund's life. As Earl of Lancaster, Edmund exercised considerable influence in northern England, where his estates provided him with independent military capability. This regional power base would later allow his descendants to challenge royal authority when relations between Lancaster and the crown deteriorated. Edmund's political style differed markedly from his brothers. Where Edward relied on force and intimidation, Edmund preferred negotiation and compromise. This approach made him valuable as a diplomatic intermediary, but sometimes frustrated Edward's more aggressive policies. Edmund served as Edward I's representative in various diplomatic negotiations, particularly with French and papal authorities. His continental connections through marriage made him especially valuable in dealings with European powers who might distrust purely English representatives. His role in the complex negotiations surrounding English claims in France demonstrated his diplomatic skill. Edmund understood the legal and feudal complexities that governed Anglo-French relations and could navigate these issues more successfully than many of Edward's other advisors. As a royal brother, Edmund also served important ceremonial functions. He represented the crown at major state occasions and provided continuity during Edward's frequent military campaigns. This role required considerable tact and political intelligence. Edmund's administrative experience included service as guardian of the realm during Edward's absences. These responsibilities provided him with practical experience in royal government and demonstrated Edward's complete trust in his brother's loyalty and competence. Edmund's children by Blanche of Artois would establish one of the most important noble dynasties in English history. His son Thomas became Earl of Lancaster and led opposition to Edward II, while daughter Eleanor married the Earl of Arundel, further spreading Lancastrian influence. The most significant descendant was Henry of Grosmont, Edmund's grandson, who became one of the most powerful nobles of the 14th century. Henry's military prowess and political influence made him virtually a second king during the early years of Edward III's reign. Through Henry of Gromont's daughter Blanche, the Lancastrian inheritance passed to John of Gaunt, third son of Edward III. This merger of Lancastrian wealth with royal blood created the power base that would eventually enable Henry Bolingbroke to seize the throne as Henry IV. The Lancastrian claim to the throne, established through Edmund's marriage and reinforced by subsequent generations, provided the legal foundation for one side in the Wars of the Roses. Edmund's descendants ruled England as the Lancastrian kings from 1399 to 1461. Edmund shared his father's interest in religious patronage and architectural projects. He founded religious houses, supported existing monasteries, and commissioned artistic works that reflected both his royal status and his personal piety. His patronage extended to scholarly activities, including the support of chroniclers and legal scholars. This investment in learning helped preserve historical records and legal precedents that illuminate the politics of his era. Edmund's court culture blended English traditions with continental influences acquired through his marriage to Blanche. This cultural synthesis enriched English noble society and strengthened connections between English and European artistic traditions. Edmund's relationship with his father Henry III was affectionate and respectful. Henry provided generously for his second son and trusted him with important responsibilities. Edmund repaid this confidence with consistent loyalty and effective service. The relationship with his brother Edward I was more complex. While generally supportive, Edmund sometimes disagreed with Edward's more aggressive policies. Their differences were handled privately, and Edmund never allowed policy disagreements to undermine his fundamental loyalty to the crown. Edmund's death in 1296 removed a moderating influence from Edward's court. His diplomatic skills and continental connections had served English interests as well, and his loss was mourned both personally by Edward and politically by those who valued his conciliatory approach to aristocratic relations. The Lancastrian dynasty that Edmund founded would eventually challenge and overthrow Edward's descendants, creating an irony that neither brother could have foreseen. Edmund's loyalty to Edward I would be repaid by his great-great-grandson's usurpation of the throne from Edward's great-grandson. Catherine was born at Westminster Palace in the summer of 1253, the youngest child of Henry III and Eleanor of Provence. She arrived during a period of relative stability in her father's reign, after the major political crises of the previous decade had been resolved. Her birth completed Henry III's family after 13 years of marriage. At 56, Henry was an elderly father by medieval standards, and Catherine represented perhaps his last opportunity for another diplomatic marriage alliance. The king's joy at her birth was recorded by contemporary chroniclers. Catherine entered a household that had perfected the art of royal child-rearing. Her older siblings had provided lessons in what worked and what didn't in preparing royal children for their destinies. She would benefit from this accumulated experience, though fate would deny her the opportunity to put her education to use. Catherine's life was tragically brief. Royal records provide few details about her childhood, suggesting she may have been sickly from birth. Medieval medicine offered little hope for children with serious health problems, regardless of their royal status. The exact nature of Catherine's illness remains unknown. Contemporary sources mention only that she was weak from birth and never thrived. Modern historians have speculated about various conditions that might have affected royal children, but definitive diagnosis is impossible from the fragmentary records. Catherine died on May 3, 1257, just short of her 4th birthday. Her death devastated Henry III, who had lost children before, but seems to have been particularly attached to his youngest daughter. The king ordered elaborate funeral arrangements befitting a royal princess. The timing of Catherine's death, during a period when Henry was consolidating his authority after the Barons' War, may have added to his grief. Personal loss compounded political stress, and chroniclers noted the king's extended period of mourning. Catherine was buried in Westminster Abbey, the church that represented Henry III's greatest architectural achievement. Her tomb was positioned near the high altar, reflecting both her royal status and her father's particular affection for his youngest child. The monument Henry commissioned for Catherine was unusually elaborate for such a young child. It featured carved angels and religious imagery that emphasized hope for resurrection and eternal life. The inscription, composed by Henry himself, revealed the depth of his parental grief. Contemporary accounts describe Henry visiting Catherine's tomb regularly, particularly on the anniversary of her death. This public display of grief was unusual for medieval kings, who were expected to maintain emotional control, but Henry's courtiers understood his need to mourn privately. The tomb became a site of prayer and remembrance for the royal family. Eleanor of Provence was buried nearby after her death in 1291, and other family members were interred in the same section of the abbey, creating a Plantagenet family mausoleum centered around Catherine's resting place. Though Catherine lived only 4 years, her memory played an important role in Henry III's conception of kingship and family. Her death reinforced his belief in the importance of religious devotion and charitable works as responses to worldly suffering. Henry's grief for Catherine influenced his architectural and artistic patronage in his later years. The king dedicated several religious foundations to her memory and commissioned artistic works that reflected his meditation on mortality and salvation. The care Henry took with Catherine's burial and memorial established precedents for royal funeral practices that influenced subsequent generations. The elaborate nature of her tomb, despite her young age, demonstrated the value the monarchy placed on family continuity and remembrance. Catherine's brief life also symbolized the fragility of medieval childhood. Even at the highest levels of society, royal children faced the same risks of disease and early death that threatened all medieval families, reminding contemporary observers that worldly power offered no protection against life's fundamental uncertainties. In the broader context of Henry III's reign, Catherine's death marked a turning point in the king's personal development. The loss of his youngest child seems to have deepened his religious devotion and his commitment to building lasting monuments that would outlive individual mortality. The contrast between Catherine's brief life and the enduring achievements of her siblings highlights the role of chance in medieval royal families. While Edward, Margaret, Beatrice, and Edmund all lived to fulfill their dynastic destinies, Catherine's potential remained forever unrealized. Yet in some ways, Catherine's memory served a purpose that her living presence might not have achieved. Her death reminded Henry III and his court of the ultimate limitations of royal power and the importance of spiritual as well as temporal concerns. The Westminster Abbey tomb where Catherine rests continues to attract visitors nearly 8 centuries after her death. In death, she achieved a kind of permanence that her brief life could never have provided, becoming part of the architectural legacy that represents Henry III's most enduring achievement. The children of Henry III carried the Plantagenet bloodline far beyond England's shores, each fulfilling a different aspect of their father's royal vision. Through marriage, conquest, and diplomacy, they established connections that would shape European politics for centuries to come. Edward I transformed his inheritance into an empire, conquering Wales and claiming Scotland while reforming English law and administration. His descendants would rule England through the Tudor period and continue in the modern Windsor line. Every British monarch since 1272 traces their ancestry through the boy born at Westminster Palace on that June day in 1239. Margaret of England carried royal blood to Scotland, where her marriage briefly promised to unite the two kingdoms peacefully. Though that dream ended with the death of her granddaughter, the Maid of Norway, Margaret's bloodline eventually returned to the English throne through the Stuart dynasty. Her diplomatic marriage represented Henry III's vision of achieving through kinship what armies could not accomplish through conquest. Beatrice of England established English influence in Brittany that would endure through the 100 Years' War and beyond. Her descendants included Anne of Brittany, who became Queen of France, carrying Henry III's genetic legacy to the highest levels of continental European nobility. Through Anne's marriages, English royal blood entered the French royal line permanently. Edmund Crouchback founded the House of Lancaster, whose wealth and power would eventually challenge the crown itself. His descendants, Henry IV, Henry V, and Henry VI, would rule England for over 60 years, fulfilling dynastic ambitions that Edmund himself never could have imagined. The Red Rose of Lancaster and the Wars of the Roses carried Edmund's bloodline into one of the most famous conflicts in English history. Even Catherine, who lived only 4 years, left her mark through the grief and devotion she inspired in her father. Her tomb in Westminster Abbey became a focal point for Plantagenet family memory and religious observance, representing the emotional bonds that motivated Henry III's architectural and spiritual ambitions. Together, these 5 children embodied different aspects of medieval kingship: military conquest, diplomatic marriage, continental alliance, territorial consolidation, and dynastic continuity. Their father, Henry III, often dismissed by historians as weak or ineffective, actually achieved through his children what many more aggressive rulers could not accomplish through force alone. The Plantagenet dynasty that began with Henry II would continue through Henry III's descendants for over 3 centuries, surviving civil wars, depositions, and foreign invasions. The bloodlines established through Henry's careful marriage diplomacy eventually converged in the Tudor dynasty and continue today in the British royal family. The children's stories also illuminate the broader patterns of medieval European politics. Royal marriages created lasting alliances that transcended individual reigns and temporary conflicts. The diplomatic investments that Henry III made in his children's futures paid dividends for generations, demonstrating the enduring value of patient, careful statecraft over immediate military solutions. Though centuries have passed, the echoes of Henry III's children still shape the crowns and bloodlines of Europe today. From Windsor Castle to the palaces of continental nobility, their genetic and cultural legacy continues. The careful nurturing of royal dynasties that Henry III practiced has proven more durable than the conquests of more famous warrior kings. In the end, Henry III's greatest achievement may not have been Westminster Abbey or the settlement of the Barons' War, but the successful launch of his children into European politics. Through them, an English king who never conquered foreign territory nonetheless established English influence across the continent in ways that would endure long after his military contemporaries were forgotten. The story of Henry III's children is ultimately the story of how medieval royal families created the political structure of later European history. Their marriages, alliances, and descendants shaped the Wars of the Roses, the 100 Years' War, the Union of England and Scotland, and countless other pivotal moments in the development of modern European nations. From the warlike Edward to the forgotten Catherine, each child contributed to a legacy that outlasted individual ambition and personal mortality. They remain, nearly 8 centuries later, ancestors and inspiration for royal families across Europe and reminders of how carefully planned dynastic strategy could achieve more lasting results than conquest alone.